Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So there's not a lot to report in terms of territorial changes. The Ukrainian offensive in the south, in the direction south of Orikhiv, with military objectives such as taking control or trying to take control, or at first penetrating the main Russian defensive barrier, which runs essentially approximately 7 kilometers south of the current line of contact on the ongoing offensive just to the south of Orikhiv. In some areas, obviously, it's much more deeper in terms of for the Ukrainians to get to the main Russian defensive belt, which is 13 kilometers deep in some areas where the Ukrainians are not actively attempting to penetrate the main Russian lines. So again, it looks as if the Ukrainians and their Western handlers, the United States, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, are closely analyzing what's happening on the ground. They understand that, look, this is a very difficult proposition. Do we keep pouring Ukrainian troops into this maelstrom of destruction? And right now, that seems to be the continued plan, to continue to pour Ukrainian troops at these very robust Russian defensive lines. But ultimately, at what purpose? What is the military goal if and when the Ukrainians are able to penetrate even this initial Russian barrier? And then what is the military objective? What is that? And I don't think that can be answered right now. Ultimately, what we're hearing in the verbiage, the narrative that is coming out of Kiev continues to be Crimea. Obviously, the Ukrainians want to retake much of this land. They want to retake the land corridor running from Mariupol to Melitopol, Berdyansk, and all this area. They want to try and get it back. But at the same time, they are continuing with this narrative that they are going to absolutely retake the Crimean Peninsula. And that's a difficult narrative that would actually come to fruition. The Russians are not going to lose the Crimean Peninsula. The Russians will use nuclear weapons if they perceive that the Crimean Peninsula is going to be overrun by Ukrainian forces. And we don't even know at this point. And at this point, it's very, very unlikely that a Ukrainian offensive, even with, and this is very important to understand, full NATO participation. Even with full NATO participation, it would be very difficult for Ukrainian and NATO forces to retake the Crimean Peninsula. And I know some of you are going to be saying, "What is this guy off his rocker? Is he crazy?" No, incredibly difficult proposition to retake the Crimea. And again, going back to nuclear weapons, the Russians will deploy nuclear weapons and use tactical nuclear weapons in this conflict, especially if they perceive the Crimean Peninsula is threatened. The Russians perceive the Crimean Peninsula as part of Russia proper. And it falls within the purview of Russian nuclear doctrine. Now, before we even get there, you have to look at a conventional victory by the Ukrainians in Zaporizhia, this area. They would have to conduct operations, penetrate these multiple Russian lines of defense, roll up these Russian lines, make their way down, create a blocking force, for Russian forces conducting offensive operations from east to west. They would have to conduct amphibious operations crossing the Dnieper River, seizing control of these vast areas, and then finally moving on to Crimea. And it's just not going to happen. It's just outside the scope of what is reasonable. Remember, the Russians have controlled the Crimea since 2014. The Russians have massive amounts of assets in the Crimea. And there was never even talk. I mean, there was talk within military circles in Ukraine about wanting to get the Crimea back, but was it realistic? No, it wasn't. And especially within the context of this current conflict, incredibly unrealistic objectives, military objectives, of retaking the Crimean Peninsula. If we are looking at active military operations against the Crimea, we're probably looking at World War III. We're looking at a much larger conflict that is going to envelop other nation states. It just is. It'll spread, it'll get bigger, it'll get larger, and take on a different dynamic. Absolutely. But right now, again, the Ukrainians are in a position that, at least within, I would say, the realistic circles of the Ukrainian military, in the realistic circles of Western military analysts, they understand that this is an incredibly tough road ahead in terms of achieving success in Zaporizhia, in the southern area. And in all likelihood, it's simply not going to happen. They're wasting huge amounts of forces in these efforts to try and penetrate these main Russian lines, and as of yet, they've really not even reached these main Russian lines. And as the war continues, the Russians are going to continue to deploy additional assets. They're going to continue to increase their production capacity. They're going to continue to start deploying new weapon systems. Just over the last 24 hours, we have seen Kryvyi Rih come under attack by Russian Iskander ballistic missiles. We believe that the Russians were targeting a command and control node in Kryvyi Rih. Obviously, the Ukrainians do not talk about the success or unsuccess of Russian strikes. They don't report on casualties. Now, I can tell you that if this was a directed Iskander strike on an apartment block full of people, there would be a lot more than 6 people dead. A lot more. But unfortunately, in this conflict, civilians are going to be casualties. Look, the Ukrainians, especially as you get closer to the front lines, are not using military bases to barracks and house their troops, because they know the Russians, one, have already hit those barracks and bases, and some of them are not even able to house troops. So they're having to house and deploy troops in civilian areas, and the Russians are watching this, and they see this, and then that's why you see these Russian strikes on a quote-unquote apartment block. But the reality is, in all probability, those areas are staging areas, or they're housing Ukrainian forces in those areas. And it's the same in cases with the Russians as well. I mean, we've seen the Ukrainians conduct HIMARS strikes on what was a civilian target, but it was repurposed as a Russian barracks. So it's the same thing. The only problem is in these densely packed cities, such as Kryvyi Rih, you're going to have more civilians in those areas than you would otherwise see in areas in the conflict zone on the Russian side of the Russian line of control. And that's what's happening. So again, just this whole notion that there's a discussion, that it's even on the table, that the objective that the Ukrainians to take the Crimean Peninsula is utterly ridiculous. And I'm surprised that that narrative is not being squashed by NATO, the United States. I'm surprised there isn't reason that is going to intervene and say, look, Ukrainians, you're not going to retake the Crimean Peninsula. It's not going to happen. So you're going to have to temper those expectations, and that can't be a part of a negotiated peace. It's just not. The Russians are going to hand it over. And then the war will continue. Well, the war is going to continue either way. Both sides have a lot of fight left in them, and that's just where we're at. And I think at this point, it's going to take either continued bloodshed, where the Ukrainians fully understand that they're not going to retake many of these areas, that the Russians are fully defending it, or we see a new Russian counteroffensive that brings the Ukrainians to the table. And then when the Ukrainians come to the table, they're going to have to be operating under the conditions that they're going to lose territory. They just are. The Crimea is gone. Now the question is how much more or how much less of this area that is currently controlled by the Russians. Are the Russians going to hand it over? Are the Ukrainians going to try to retake it? Are the Russians going to try to take more territory? At the end of the day, I would say that for a successful Russian military operation, I would think that Kharkov would have been a primary strategic goal for the Russians, to take Kharkov. I think they've met a lot of goals in terms of, if we go back and we look at this conflict and we look at what the different options of the Russians were. Remember, if we go back to the start of the conflict, we talked about, well, the Russians may just try to seize a land corridor. They may try to retake Luhansk and Donetsk. Or option one was the seizure of the remaining of Luhansk and Donetsk. Option two was the land corridor. Then option three was the full-on attempted takeover of Ukraine. And I think the Russians did attempt option three. I think they did try Red Arrow. I think they did try to get into Kiev, and that failed. And now it's option two. Maintain the land corridor with possibility of the concession prize as Kharkov at some point. I still think that's on the table. So that's where we are. Again, we will continue to monitor the situation. Not a great deal of movement. We continue to see the war of the cities, the use of cruise missile attacks, the use of drones, both by Russia, by the Ukrainians, against targets inside of Russia, inside of Ukraine. That will continue. And I think at some point, both sides are going to understand, unless we see just a massive offensive by the Russians, which we could. I've talked about that before. Again, keep your eye Seversk, north of Seversk. I still think we're going to see some operations in the direction of Kharkov, Kupiansk, Izium, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk. I think those are still viable military goals for the Russians at this point. So again, we will continue to monitor the situation and report. Thank you for joining us today. And as always, have a good day.